Hallo und herzlich willkommen zu Folge 29. Ihr hört den Podcast der Atlantischen Akademie Amerikas Verfassung, Politik und Gesellschaft in den USA. Mit dabei sind Sarah Wagner
und David Serakow. Heute haben wir eine ganz besondere Folge für euch. Wir durften Megan Shahi, die Direktorin für Technologiepolitik des Center for American Progress in Washington DC, bei uns in Kaiserslautern begrüßen und haben das auch gleich dazu genutzt, mit ihr über die Tech-Unternehmen, mögliche Regulierungen und die Rolle und Auswirkungen von Social Media auf unsere Demokratien zu sprechen. Das gleich folgende Interview haben wir am Montag, den 1. Juli aufgenommen. Bevor wir aber loslegen, kommt jetzt noch unser kurzes und knappes Housekeeping. Am 16. Juli werden wir uns im Rahmen unseres Atlantischen Forums gemeinsam mit der Politikwissenschaft der RPTU Kaiserslautern mit der Außenpolitik nach den Präsidentschaftswahlen befassen. Wir schauen ein wenig in die Glaskugel. Würde Joe Biden seinen außenpolitischen Kurs fortsetzen und weiterhin internationale Allianzen und die Unterstützung der Ukraine fördern? Welche außenpolitischen Prioritäten vertritt Donald Trump und unterscheiden sich diese möglicherweise von der Republikanischen Partei? Diese und weitere Fragen erörtern wir mit Maida Ruge, Senior Policy Fellow am European Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin. Die Veranstaltung findet online statt und ihr seid alle herzlich dazu eingeladen. Den Link zur Anmeldung findet ihr wie immer in den Shownotes. Und nun geht es zu unserem Interview mit Megan Shahi.
We are absolutely thrilled to welcome a special guest today to discuss the topic of social media and technology with us. Joining us today is Megan Shahi, the Director of Technology Policy at the Center for American Progress. And Megan is currently in Germany as part of a speaker tour organized by the Aspen Institute Germany and funded by the US Embassy Berlin. So we're very excited to have her and share her time with us. And before we dive into our talk and hear her expertise, we of course want to introduce our guest a little bit. So we're quoting from the website of the Center for American Progress right now. Megan has extensive experience across the US public and private sectors and has spent the majority of her career promoting transparency and accountability inside some of the world's most influential social media companies. She is deeply passionate about enacting smart and future-proof technology regulation in the United States and positively influencing the intersection of technology and public policy. So we will also link to the website of the Center for American Progress, where you can find out more information about Megan and also a variety of resources. So for example, interviews she has given, reports she has written, and much more. We can highly recommend her report from 2023, Protecting Democracy Online in 2024 and Beyond, where Megan offers detailed recommendations to tech companies so that we can make sure, and I quote her here, that elections are safe, accessible, and protected online and offline, end quote. So Megan, sorry, after this lengthy introduction, thank you so much for taking the time and welcome to our podcast.
Thank you so much. Thank you both for having me. Very, very excited to be in Germany this week.
Yeah, Megan, thank you so much for taking the time and welcome to our podcast. Let's start with talking a little bit more about your work and career life. What is especially interesting when it comes to you is that you have experience in the private as well in the government sector. You have worked for companies such as Meta and Twitter or X, but your career started in government in the White House Domestic Policy Council. Can you tell us a bit more about your switch between these spheres? What motivated you to switch and the differences?
Absolutely. So I started my career in public service, like you said, and kind of always knew that I wanted to serve in government in some way. I was very passionate about current events and international affairs as a kid. And that, dovetailed into what I majored in college and ultimately what I first did out of school. And what I realized is that in DC, oftentimes these jobs are tied to an administration in power. And so when the administration changed over in 2016, I realized I needed to find a path that wasn't so closely aligned with the administration in DC. And so I grew up in the Bay Area, surrounded by tech and tech companies, and that's really kind of always been an area of just personal interest for me as a result. And so when it came time to figure out where to go, I thought about tech, and I thought about the tech companies and seeking out a way to work on policy issues, which is my sort of function of interest and my passion. but in the tech industry. And it was really a nascent space and honestly still is. But that really kind of was the catalyst that led me to go to Facebook, then to Instagram specifically, and then on to Twitter. And most recently, after Elon Musk took over Twitter in 2022 and famously fired the entire policy team on the first day, myself included, I realized that it was actually an opportunity to step back and to say that after a number of years working on these issues inside of the company, there may be untapped potential to go back to DC and to help shape the regulatory strategy of how DC and the states and just generally policymakers are thinking about technology policy issues. And I firmly believe you can't successfully regulate an industry without that perspective. And that's ultimately what has landed me at a think tank, which I definitely laughed at that when someone told me that CAP was hiring a director of tech policy. And now here I am a year and a half later. But I think, ultimately this sort of unique path that I've taken has made me a stronger policymaker and a better technologist and more aware of the trade-offs and the nuances in the public policy conversation around tech, especially now that we have AI kind of at the forefront and generative AI. It's all deeply, deeply related. And I think in order to successfully balance the opportunities and the risks, you need people who have worked on these issues.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And I think it's also such a great example how much more common it is in the United States to switch between these different spheres, right? It's not as rigid as maybe we know here from Germany. So maybe talking a little bit in detail now about your experiences, and let's start with the private sector. So you were a crisis manager in Meta's first ever U.S. election war room, aptly titled in 2018.
Nice title.
Can you talk a bit about your work in this context, right? How it was influenced by the election of 2016, how the election, of course, of 2016 also played out in social media. Sort of what were your takeaways from your work in this specific setting, and what was your experience like?
Sure. So in 2016, as listeners may or may not know, there was a very kind of targeted influence operation campaign to sway U.S. voters using Facebook ads and organic content. We later coined the term disinformation around this kind of content with intent to manipulate. And this was a very, very big shift. There is a before 2016 and an after when you think about social media. And that's ultimately what drove the shift to integrity and to election integrity and entire teams being stood up to work on these problems, perennial teams. And as part of all these efforts, Facebook also stood up what they first called a war room that has since taken on a much better title of Information Operations Center, I think.
Okay. Much better.
Election Protection Operations Center, something like that. But it was first a war room. And what it did was it brought a bunch of stakeholders from across the company that had some kind of tie-in to elections, from product, from engineering, from legal, from design, from operations, like truly everyone, language support, and put them all in one physical room in Menlo Park. And this was the first time the company had ever done anything like this. And of course, there were the very splashy headlines on the New York Times. We had a big press day where they came in and took pictures of the war room, and there was some of that, but the reality and in practice what kind of happened was that as things started to bubble to the surface in real time in the month and weeks leading up, and even on election day, this group of stakeholders representative of various kind of interests and functions around the company was able to crisis manage in real time. So we had folks from the legal team and the public policy team and engineering all talking about a misinformation problem and reaching a solution way faster than maybe they would have prior. A lot of these systems and these functions just did not talk to each other the same way or were not set up. And so 2018 became the year of no story for Facebook regarding the elections, and that's why it never comes up and isn't really relevant these days when we think about the history of Facebook and elections and social media and elections, is because as much of a press moment as the war room was, having actually worked in there and managing a bunch of the crises, it definitely did the job. It really worked, and that's why today there exists various flavors of this that the company will deploy for various elections around the world. And I think it's a model that smaller companies and other similarly sized companies should follow.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. And do you think that the big technology companies in the US, maybe worldwide, have improved in this regard? Not only Meta, or where do you see vulnerabilities that need to be addressed, especially ahead of this year's elections?
Yeah, so I think the pendulum we had the 2016 moment, and then there was 2018, which was we are investing heavily. We got this down. We're working on solutions. We have this war room. We have the headlines, the pictures. And then the pendulum started to sort of swing back the other way. And this is due to political pressure in the United States, due to layoffs of election integrity teams, of language support specialists, due to the advent of new technologies like generative AI that have made solving these problems more challenging. And so if you had asked me in 2019 this question, I would say, absolutely, the industry is moving in the right direction. And now you look at how many teams have been disbanded, how many people have been laid off, and against a backdrop of estimated 3 to 4 billion people voting around the world this year, and with an information ecosystem that is weak, that is fragile, and without strong regulation in the US. And so, unfortunately, I don't think we have kind of come as far as I would have really liked by the time we have this huge year of elections, as everyone is calling it.
Mm-hmm. Basically, your report, or this is the main motivation behind your report, and what were your recommendations for the tech companies?
Yeah, so the genesis of the report was that I got to a think tank, and a lot of people that I talked with in my new role at Center for American Progress were eager to tell the companies what to do, and had been telling the companies what to do, largely unsuccessfully. And the companies were quick to write off a letter that a bunch of people and organizations signed on to, or they were quick to say, you don't understand the technical side of this problem, so we're just going to kind of brush you off politely and move on. And so when I got to my role, I said, why don't I write this with the vocabulary and the vernacular and the way that they think about these problems? Let me write it that way. And so I put on my policy hat from having worked on tech policy issues inside of social media companies, and I wrote it in that style. And so product managers and data scientists and engineers and policy people in the companies cannot tell me they don't understand this report, because this report looks and feels very similar to the kind of work that my teams previously did in the companies. And so that was kind of step one. Step two was really breaking it down into bite-sized pieces that individual platforms could take or leave depending on their needs. So Twitch is a video streaming platform. They have really different needs than Instagram, which has really, really different needs than Snapchat and YouTube and the Microsoft App Store for Xbox. There are so many different kinds of platforms, and each have their own kind of nuanced needs and risks to users. And so this is kind of like a grab bag of things that platforms can then take what they need from. So if a platform has advertising, great, there's an entire section on political ads and recommendations very targeted for how companies can implement. There's a lot of auditing of like making recommendations to audit existing systems, because so much of what I experienced was that we were using legacy lists and legacy sources and old information on what was considered an authoritative source of information, and not updating those and going through and having a collaborative group of stakeholders make sure that that list is up to date is a huge problem when it comes to information integrity. And so there are big recommendations, there are small ones, there are niche ones, and there are ones that I think apply really broadly, but they are all kind of catered to solving this problem in a really comprehensive way. They cover staffing, they cover being more transparent, and there are some around the process and the policies that set precedent in an election period that then get walked back. How do you set precedent in a way that is externally defensible to regulators or users? And I think like a lot of these questions don't get asked in the moment because it's a crisis period. And so I put this out in 2023 to give the companies time to ask themselves these questions.
Yeah, very, very smart and sort of long-term thinking. So we already mentioned it, we will also link to the report so you can all have a look at it and check out the details. So when we talk about, you already mentioned, okay, the election and voting and the role of misinformation, disinformation. So of course, a question arises if there's that there is this inherent battle when it comes to the companies, right, to protect democracy, but also, of course, they have an interest in increasing their revenue. They have shareholders. So do you see a willingness truly sort of among tech companies to prioritize the protection of democracy? Because it is a business model, right, at the end of the day that prioritizes clicks and sort of outrage and clickbait to have people engage and spend time on these apps and engage with a very specific type of content.
Yeah, I think that exact conundrum is what led me away from another job at another tech company when I had the opportunity to go to, another platform after the Elon Musk situation. I stepped back and I said, it's probably going to be the same story that I've seen at the others, which is that ultimately the incentives are misaligned and they're not going to favor regulation and policy and transparency and protecting kids, because ultimately they're for-profit institutions that do what for-profit institutions do best, which is keep making money. And in the US, you see the example of the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, or the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And you have all of these sort of counterbalance regulatory agencies for industries that can be harmful if left unchecked. And so social media and the tech and digital ecosystem is no different. It's just that we have given them the opportunity to self-regulate unsuccessfully until now. And so I don't actually expect Facebook to successfully self-regulate or to want to self-regulate in a way that favors all of the things that we talk about here, or that, Parliament and the EU cares about, because they're different organizations completely. We can't expect Pfizer and the FDA to do the exact same thing because they want all the same things. That's unrealistic. And so part of what I seek to do now is articulate those trade-offs really clearly to Congress or to the White House or to the companies, because I have this kind of unique view of both sides. And, the last thing I'll say on that is you hear people in the US and in the EU being whistleblowers around sharing content that they shouldn't share about their time in the companies, or taking information that they had and sort of creating a really big inflammatory narrative around how evil the companies are. And I am very, very, very clearly not here to do that. I'm not a whistleblower. I'm not pointing fingers and saying you're all evil. I was one of those evil people, if so, which wouldn't make sense. And I firmly believe that there is a lot of good intent in the companies, especially on the policy and trust and safety teams. It's just a game of incentives and trade-offs at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I do appreciate that you are really also using your expertise, as you were saying, sort of not to play into a specific morality narrative, but also offering concrete recommendations, but also calling out things where you say, okay, this is not a great way to do business, for example. So for our audience at home, we will also link to Megan's op-ed in The Hill, where she discusses Facebook's ad policy when it comes to disinformation or misinformation in election campaigning, which I think is super interesting, and I highly recommend you check out and read.
I wonder if your personal background helps to get this information, get these recommendations out, or is it from the tech company side rather problematic or a challenge?
It's a good question. It's a hypothesis I'm still testing. And I
they
think, see
you as a traitor.
Yeah. Anytime I'm on a call with them, they're sort of like, oh, it's Megan. Equal parts happy and unhappy to see me.
That's good. That's good. Sounds.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Just on the other side of the table.
Can imagine.
And so, I ask tougher questions than maybe most civil society groups that they talk to. But I'm hopeful that if nothing else, even if a single change is not made inside of a single company because of this report or because of the work I do, what I do know is happening is it is making people in DC that care about this stuff smarter. And so in mass, if you take that exact kind of phenomenon and you extrapolate it over 10, 15 years, hopefully that will lead to better regulation of tech companies. I have to believe like the fact that this report exists and defines so many terms that people were using in different ways and really lists out things using product and engineering terminology and machine learning and classifiers and all of these things, that it is just raising the sea for everybody, even if the companies don't make changes right away.
Another important topic in this context when we talk about elections and technology, social media and democracy is, of course, the field of journalism. So we have not only seen many layoffs in the tech sector, but also in the journalism sector, right? So newspapers struggle, sort of these old established forms of media. We have news deserts in certain areas of the United States. So can you talk a little bit about the current interplay between journalism and social media companies? So what's the current status? And, we see developments on Twitter or on X. There's now only a specific way how links to articles are displayed. We have different regulations in countries like Canada, right, when it comes to Facebook feeds and the media. So what's your current, I know it's a very broad question. So talk about journalism and social media,
How
please.
long do we have?
Oh, we can, absolutely.
I'm here all
the
week.
time you need. Perfect.
Yeah, great question. I think what has happened is an already informationally asymmetrical environment has just become more and more and more asymmetrical. And so some people have certain information, other people have differing or parts of that same information. And it is leading to greater polarization, less awareness of world events. In the recent Israel-Gaza crisis, we couldn't make out on Twitter what was real and what wasn't. And that was well-intentioned, educated, digitally literate people unable to differentiate that, which is dangerous and can cause loss of life at the absolute worst. And so it's a really patchwork, messy system. There's no easy answer. Canada, of course, has pulled all news from Facebook and Google, and we were close to having that happen in Australia as well. And so you can think about all the information that Canadians are not receiving on their social media, and there's a good portion of millennials and younger that primarily imbibe news via social media. Yeah. So that asymmetric information right there is already creating differences in worldviews and public opinion and social discourse. And you can imagine that happening when journalists leave X or when Elon Musk makes a decision to kick a bunch of journalists off X, right? There is no requirement legally, broadly, right? Of course, individual countries have their things, but there's no broad requirement that journalists must be allowed or must not be allowed. And so as we kind of have this patchwork system of some on Threads and some on X and people getting banned, and there's a lack of transparency into what leads to those bans, we just further fracture the information ecosystem. And it's incumbent on all of us to find solutions, but there's absolutely no silver bullet.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for elaborating on this, because I think exactly what you mentioned, this fragmentation and people are in their own spheres of news and information, right? It's, you can see that this public sphere of discourse is also shrinking, right? So it's not just fragmented, that people are in different spheres, but also the quality is kind of going down. If we look at important media channels such as Twitter or X, that has become a very different place, with the new management, I would say.
Yeah, let's get Germany and the EU in this discussion. And in Germany and in the EU, the regulations of big companies and the implementation of protection measures are hot topics. In the United States, we have a big discussion surrounding TikTok, the ban or maybe selling TikTok to an American company. Are there transatlantic similarities in the way politicians or even the public talk about social media and democracy, or are these different cultures?
Yeah, so I think at a high level, lowercase d, democracy, the values of those are kind of shared between the EU and the US. And being in Germany, I feel that as well. I think if you take it to a layer below or even a couple below that, that's where you start to feel some of the differences, I think. In the EU, there's a really strong right and desire for individual data privacy. And that value comes above and ahead of things like maybe national security or protections for a country or different kind of qualifications that individuals and that countries make about what matters most to them. And in the US, it's a different conversation. We're more focused on national security, on keeping Americans safe, on protectionism, on innovation is another one. You know, oftentimes the trope in Silicon Valley is that Brussels is the dog that caught its regulatory tail, and that now it's kind of just regulating all these American companies. And, you know, American companies are not based here. They're based in America, and they're founded on American values. And so there is this difference when we look at the GDPR or DSA or the EU AI Act, where there are portions that are awesome. I agree with large swaths of what is in all of those regulations, but there are also portions that the US, based on our values of freedom of speech and national security and how we view privacy and how we rank all of those things against one another, because everything is trade-offs at the end of the day. It's a different type of regulation that we might want to adopt. And that's ultimately what holds us back a little bit, is that you have across the political spectrum, even though we're all American and even though tech policy is actually broadly a bipartisan issue, you have different values driving different parts of the important things that people want to regulate around tech policy. And so it's really challenging. Even in Germany, there's a really strong anti-hate speech sentiment, which makes complete sense given the history and what all this country has endured till today. And so there's a local law called NetzDG that requires platforms to act really swiftly when they get a notification about a potential hate crime happening online or hate speech being posted online. That kind of law would be challenged by the First Amendment very, very significantly in the US. And that doesn't mean Germany is not a democracy or that the US is not a democracy. It's just that when you drill down into the nuance here, you start to see some of these differences. India is a thriving democracy, and the way that they think about and that we may operate with social media in India is very different than even in the EU, let alone in the US. And so each of these kind of prevailing value systems has a lot of pros, but also a lot of trade-offs. And every organization and government and civil society group has to articulate what they care about and what they're more willing to acquiesce on.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we started noticing this too, sort of this impact, the different laws when it comes to, for example, freedom of speech or potential, regulating hate speech. Sometimes when we would have comments, do you remember back in the day on our Twitter feed? But it wasn't that the comment was gone, but it was like we couldn't see it, right? And there was sort of a sign that says like, this is not allowed in your country. And we're like, but we need to know what is being said on our account, but we couldn't access it.
Yeah. So we needed a VPN connection to see it from the US side. So
so if we need to respond to it or what we can say, because we couldn't access it otherwise.
What it said.
Tweet about.
Exactly.
That's a far right, to say the least, tweet.
And that's the information asymmetry right there in practice. You had to do a unique technological solution that you're afforded the opportunity to have a VPN, right?
Yeah.
There are people who just see that and move on, and their view of an issue is manipulated as a result. It's well-intended regulation. I don't blame the regulator for putting in that protection, right? Because they felt that the trade-off for posing harm to Germans or Europeans, depending on which law it was greater. The importance of mitigating that was greater than making sure everyone had the clear, balanced perspective. In the US, we take the opposite approach. Yeah. We say you have to see all the mis and disinfo out there and make an informed view, right? And so, again, it's trade-offs.
Yeah, as you said, there are a lot of differences, even if we from a value perspective, quite similar. But despite these differences, is there a crossover maybe? So are maybe stricter regulations, for instance, passed in the EU or in Germany, also something that influence tech companies in the US, or maybe can be a model for US legislation?
Is that such a German question to you? You're smiling? Or is it just like, nope, we'll just make this happen for Europe. We're good over here.
Nice question, but no.
We're going to do our thing. No, actually, yes. I do think that there are portions of, if you look at GDPR and CCPA, the California Privacy Act, there's a lot of overlap. There was a heavy borrowing from GDPR, and all the companies are based in California. So the natural kind of floor has risen as a result of like downstream effects from GDPR. And so we have seen that already happen. In some ways good, in some ways not so good, depending on kind of who you talk to and what they care about. With DSA and DMA, the Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act, which are the two kind of premium digital legislative frameworks coming out of Brussels, we see certain portions of both of those that are going to require the companies and have been requiring the companies. And I know this because at Twitter, I worked on the DSA implementation strategy. There's going to be so much money and time and engineering and effort and labor that go into making these changes that for certain things, the floor is going to rise naturally. And the flip side of this coin is like, oh, that's the Brussels effect. And, Brussels is regulating American companies on a different set of values. But the benefit is that in a Congress where we can't get this kind of legislation passed because of our own value considerations, there are ideally going to be benefits to American users, to users all over the world that are going to reap the benefits of certain small changes that they will make. And it varies depending on platform, and the beauty of the DSA is that it's a little bit of a choose your own adventure in some ways. It doesn't equally regulate every platform. And two things I think are especially prudent on DSA, which is the first is transparency. It requires more transparency from the platforms, which in my view is never a bad thing, no matter kind of how you cut it. More reporting, more specific types of data have to be included in these transparency reports, broken out by country, by language. That all is more robust than what exists today. And I think that's great. The second thing is researcher access. A huge component of this conversation is around independent bodies that can do unbiased, fair, and in a non-pressurized or lobbying or anything kind of sense research. And in the US, this is like the hobby horse that I ride all the time, which is like the importance of researcher access. And the DSA does this. And the DSA says we're going to have a vetting program and we're going to get certain vetted researchers access to the data that they need to do their jobs. And in the US, this has come under attack, unfortunately, because of, many political reasons. But I think the DSA gets this right. This and transparency. If there's two takeaways, it's those two.
Big challenge for colleagues.
Absolutely.
Who works on one colleague. He works on X or on Twitter feeds, and that is really difficult.
Yep.
Yeah. So as academics, we love to hear that you're supporting these policy positions.
Yeah.
So we already talked a bit about, legislation in the EU. You already mentioned Congress. And I think it's always interesting when, you're on social media and you see clips from hearings in Congress where the heads or, representatives of tech companies come into a hearing. And I think they're oftentimes flabbergasted when they see, okay, the politicians are maybe not truly experts in this, very complex technology field. Yeah, to put it mildly. And in addition to that, that it is a challenging subject, right? So you have also a Congress that is divided right now. So it's not very productive currently in terms of passing legislation. So all that aside, though, are there some promising developments that you see, or are there maybe some pieces of legislation that might be tossed around that, maybe even would gain bipartisan support, or that you think would be very interesting and helpful if they were being passed?
So if you look at tech issues vis-a-vis other American kind of policy issues that are divisive and hot button issues right now, tech is actually like the little sister that is playing nice and not as, controversial as something like abortion or gun rights in the US. There is actually if you take like the broadest interpretation, there is support from both sides on tech issues and on regulating tech. People generally know we're at this moment with AI and, we have an opportunity to regulate. And so I would say that two or three specific areas that tech that both sides are promising about is, one, data privacy. There is a strong desire and need for a federal privacy bill. The second is protecting kids online. That's another area that people feel pretty strongly is important. Again, the nuances are a different thing. You're going to get different sides advocating for different parts of kids' safety or different parts of data protection and data privacy. And then the third is AI. That's also, of course, such a hot button issue right now, and we're all trying to get our arms around it or create some contours around what AI legislation could look like. And so between those three, I would say those are probably the kind of most promising areas. But again, our value system is that freedom of speech and all those different values I mentioned earlier kind of competing for one another's sort of top spot. And so because of that, we may have challenges getting any of that passed. It may never happen. I'm in this business because I'm hopeful it will. But there's definitely worse issues that are more divided right now. And I would say tech is not among them, which is a blessing.
A little bit of hope.
Yes.
Yeah. Some positive things here to say. Speaking of artificial intelligence, we're also curious to hear your opinion on the new developments and especially the challenges, of course, to navigate the online world increase of using it. So it is already a challenge with the new platforms, ChatGPT and so on and so forth. How does this development potentially impact elections from your point of view, not just in the US, but around the globe and for instance, in democracies?
So what I say about AI is similar to pretty much anything on technology, which is that it makes good things better and bad things worse. And when I think about the moment that we're in with AI and democracy and elections, and actually you can extrapolate it to health policy and labor and jobs, it is about balancing the risks and mitigating those risks, and then also tapping into the immense opportunity of that technology. And so I actually, based on what we've seen this far with this year of elections, as we start the second half of the year today, we can look back at the first 6 months of the year and see what has the role of AI been? And has it been these deep fakes that have changed, manipulated minds and all of these fears that we had with the really splashy headlines when ChatGPT came out? And that hasn't really been realized, which is good. But what we have seen is that social media platforms continue to be the place where information is distributed. And ultimately, ChatGPT or Google Bard or whatever it is, it's a tool. And so people will use that tool to do great things like write to their congressman about an issue they care about, draft a letter that they were nervous or didn't know how to draft, or plan a trip or find a recipe or decorate a house. And they're also going to use that exact same tool for misinformation creation, to think through strategies on disinformation campaigns, to manipulate public opinion, to write information or create deep fakes or drawings or pictures or videos that are not real, to get politicians to say and do things they didn't do. And so it is the same thing. It's the flip side of the same coin. And, we're in this year of elections. We have all these information ecosystem problems that I talked about. And then you add this new groundbreaking technology of generative AI, and it just, it just weakens everything. And we just continue to have to look at solutions that we have been looking at. The other thing is that AI broadly has existed, right? It's in our iPhones, it's in our feeds. We operate in a world that is, really using AI already. It's just that it has come to the forefront because of ChatGPT, because of that November 2022 moment that we had. And so we should use this moment to say, hey, let's get this right, and let's not look back at the last 20 years like we do social media and say, oh, shoot, we had a chance to regulate and we didn't. And now there's been mass shootings, there have been major issues with self-esteem, with harm online, with bullying, with harassment, with hate speech, with crimes. I mean, January 6th in the United States, there's so many issues that have been tied back to the role of social media. And so we have this moment with AI, and we have all these elections happening, and let's take this momentum to really build a framework around how to democratically regulate AI.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe what I would see though also as a bit of a different quality when it comes to AI or some of these extra challenges in terms of environmental impact, right? So that's like one thing, or copyright issues, or this idea of like, different communities, artists or writers, how they will approach this tool, or how the general public will then potentially use it responsibly or not. All right, we covered a lot of ground in this talk. So first off, thank you so much for this. But last but not least, we don't want to let you go without also digging maybe a little bit into your social media habits. Because, of course, you're an expert. So I assume maybe you use, social media very differently than I might use it. So I'll be very honest about this.
You'd be surprised.
I will not comment that.
Please do not. Please do not. Yes, so maybe, and we also would like to leave our listeners with a little bit of maybe actionable input. So on the one hand, we're curious to hear about sort of how has your work experience shaped your personal use of social media? And also, what do you recommend for people who maybe want to learn more about the role of media and democracy, sort of where to get maybe good information from? Are there specific books you can recommend, or a podcast, or sort of just in general how to look for good information?
Absolutely. So my own social media life has evolved. I don't use TikTok. That's kind of the platform that I just have never downloaded it, and I know I'll spend too much time on it.
You will, so good choice.
And, they have murky data practices that I'm, not totally clear on. And in the US, we have a forced divestment situation going. So as someone who works on these issues, it's just better that I don't. Instagram is probably my choice of all of them. I also, of course, worked there, and so there's a personal connection, but the kind of boundary that I have personally drawn with Instagram is actually that I only use it on the weekends.
Okay.
And I share this with people, and they're always kind of perplexed, and then it I think clicks for them. But during the week, I find that I end up like in a little bit of a rabbit hole kind of situation, and I don't prioritize time with my spouse, or I don't prioritize working on something that was on my to-do list, or getting to a workout class, because ultimately that 15 minutes or that 30 minutes or whatever it was ends up devolving into something that took over something else.
Sounds too familiar, Megan.
Yes, exactly.
A lot of faces in the room at the moment.
Well, I know. Well, because also that's how it's designed, right? It is super
correct.
appealing. That dopamine hit goes directly to you.
Yes. I mean, Reels is like totally, like I will spend 2 hours if given the chance just watching Reels. And so, and I also personally feel like social anxiety when I'm on Instagram during the week, because my weeks are really busy, and I don't tend to do a lot of like social stuff on the weeknights just because I'm tired. And so when I see people doing that stuff, I feel guilt, and I'm a woman in my 30s feeling FOMO and guilt, and I can't empathize enough with the 15-year-olds on social media and what they must feel without the mental tools and the stability and foundation that I have.
Yeah.
The
pressure. I feel the pressure on a Tuesday that I'm not at a wine bar.
Yeah.
How must they feel, right? And but I also love seeing what my friends are up to. And so on Fridays at like 3:00, I get it on my phone and I enjoy it for the weekend. And it becomes this enjoyable experience for me. And I don't feel this immense guilt that I spent 45 minutes on it on a Sunday, because that's part of my Sunday routine is that
it's a little treat.
Hop
and
on the elliptical and I scroll on Instagram for a while, right? And then come Sunday night, I take it off my phone. And it's a separation again. It's like the app goes on and off my phone. It's not like it's hidden in a folder thing, because my addictive habits will find it. So that's my own personal relationship with Instagram, but it has served me well. So I recommend it for people.
Yeah, that's great.
Who are looking to put a little more kind of boundary around it. As far as where to go, I mean, there's so much literature out there, which, people kind of can receive in the topic of information. Like you can receive information in so many ways. I'm also happy to send a list of like my personal newsletters that I subscribe to. There's so many, at least, in the US and also in the EU, I'm sure, around what's happening in Brussels, that cover the trickiness of tech policy and the trickiness of trying to regulate how people speak and say things and receive information. It is regulating a sector that has not kind of existed for that long. And so I will forward you like I think it's like almost 20 or 25 newsletters that I'm subscribed to. Do I read all of them every day? No, they all go to a folder. But when I want to, I kind of have a place. The Technology 202, the Daily Tech Brief. There's so many. The UN just put out a really good piece on mis and disinformation that actually really impressed me. And I'm like, okay, the UN is getting in the game, And so there's so many places. And then, of course, working at a think tank, I read a ton for my work, and I write a ton for my work as well. So I will forward you some stuff. And then last plug is for a book called Broken Code by Jeff Horowitz, who used to work at Facebook and worked on pretty much everything we've talked about today. And he kind of does a behind the scenes look at what all kind of transpired during those 2016 years and in the lead up, really, that led the company to be in that position that kind of happened. And so I encourage people to read it if they're trying to build some empathy for well-intentioned people trying to solve tough problems inside the companies.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much. So we will definitely add all these resources then to our homepage, of course, to the podcast episode, and also add some of the German resources in German language speaking. So for example, what we have here is the social media watch blog. So that's also a German source that very heavily deals with these topics.
We really appreciate your not only the professional insights, but also the personal insights and the personal recommendations when it comes to social media habits. Megan, thank you so much for joining us today here in Kaiserslautern and for all the events that you are doing in Germany and for sharing your expertise with us. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Megan, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Das war Folge 29 unseres Podcasts Amerikas Verfassung, Politik und Gesellschaft in den USA. Wir hoffen, euch hat diese Ausgabe und dieses besondere Interview gefallen. Und wenn ihr sie euren Freundinnen oder Kolleginnen empfehlen möchtet, darüber freuen wir uns natürlich ganz besonders. Ihr könnt den Podcast ganz einfach überall finden, auf unserer Website, auf Spotify, Apple Podcasts und natürlich bei allen anderen bekannten Streaming-Anbietern. Gerne könnt ihr auch einen Kommentar hinterlassen. Wir freuen uns natürlich auch sehr über positive Bewertungen, zum Beispiel bei Apple Podcasts. Und wenn ihr Themen oder Sachen habt, über die wir einfach mal sprechen sollten und die mit den USA zu tun haben, idealerweise, dann könnt ihr auch auf unserer Website das Feedback-Formular verwenden. Wir freuen uns auf die nächste Folge, wünschen euch bis dahin alles Gute, bleibt gesund, kommt gut mit der Hitze zurecht und passt gut auf euch auf.
Habt eine gute Zeit.